Hello and welcome to another episode on the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella. You are in for such a treat all of this week. We're doing something a little different. Now, a few days ago, I was saying that we've ticked over the 50 episode milestone, which is pretty huge. So I thought this week we could pause, reflect, and unpack some of the more powerful moments on the Everyday Joy podcast. So I've gone back through the archives. I've picked out the 5 episodes that I've received the most feedback on. And all this week, I'll be diving deeper into the top 5 episodes on the Everyday Joy podcast with a brand new guest. So let's get into today's Bible verse.
Keep your temper under control. It's foolish to harbour a grudge.
Once again, I have got the amazing MJ here in studio with me to help unpack some of the more popular moments on the Everyday Joy podcast. MJ, are you good at apologies?
Is it wrong to say yes?
No, I think that's awesome. That's really good.
I think I've worked really hard over a long period of time through a lot of my 20s where I felt like apologising was a show of weakness. But I've learned as I've got towards the latter part of my 30s that it's actually closer to meekness, where it's strength under control.
Wow.
And so it's definitely something that's not a natural gift, but realising the power it brings to you and others is massive.
100%. And you know, I think that's one of the reasons why this episode is so popular, because like you mentioned earlier, an apology is so incredibly powerful. But when an apology isn't given, it can equally have such a devastating effect. So today we're focusing on episode 11, titled Waiting for an Apology. And in this episode, Ash talks about a time in her life when she was hurt and was expecting an apology. And in the waiting, she found herself succumbing to bitterness and anger until she actually realized that she could not assume anymore that she was going to get an apology. Have a quick listen to the audio.
And I wanted them to know how mad I was. I wanted them to know. This sounds so bad, but I genuinely struggled. And I think because it was one of the first moments where I was really encountering genuine forgiveness where I needed to in order to get my peace back. It was difficult. I really just had this almost every day, probably for a season, where I was just like, I want them to know how hurt I am. And it really did hurt my day-to-day life. I remember kind of walking around almost being like, what if I run into them? Like, if I run into them, how am I going to deal with this situation? And that went on for probably 6 months or so of just this constant state of being frustrated and fearful and all the things that come with not forgiving a situation.
Yeah.
But I remember a moment, and it probably got to like the peak of that. And a pastor had said to me once, you're not always going to get an apology. And that changed my life, because I think in a way I was kind of like, they're going to have a moment where they're going to realize what they've done and they're going to call me and they're going to apologize and things will be great. And I just kind of had this moment where I went, that's actually not going to happen most likely.
Yeah. So if you want to know more about that episode and what Ash did next, make sure you go back and listen to episode 11. Why do you think, MJ, this conversation struck such a chord with listeners?
I think because we've all found moments in life where we've been hurt by people that we loved and cared about, or people that we've put in positions of influence over our life that disappointed us or didn't meet an expectation or failed to do what they said they would do. And so it's unfortunately probably a universal experience as you grow up, that someone you care for or someone that you elevate in your life, rightly or wrongly, does something that hurts, disappoints, or frustrates you. And so I think the reason of the resonance was very much around that's me too, and I don't know, what do I do with that? How do I process that? How do I live through that as a believer and a follower? So I think that was the connection piece.
Yeah, speaking of living through something like that, Have you ever experienced anything along these lines?
Yeah, way too much, unfortunately. Whether it be, I've been married for nearly 20 years, so both of us have given each other opportunities to feel grudge, resentment, disappointment, anger, frustration. I used to be a pastor for over 10 years in multiple different scenarios, from teenagers and campus pastoring and a bunch of different things, and working here at Positive Media too with a bunch of different people. There's been moments across every single one of those where anger, hurt, bitterness and disappointment come in, and as a result you start to resent people. Grudge starts to come. You get around these people and environments, you start to feel a bit tighter in your chest. You no longer feel like you can be fully yourself in and around these people, and you become awkward and weird. And if they don't see it, you know it.
Yeah.
And you start making up moments like, how do I get out of this? Like, what do I do?
I will take the other route to the bathroom.
Yeah, I'll walk the other way. I'll be sick that day when I know I'm going to see that person. I'll walk. If it's in church, I'll sit on a different side to avoid them. I'll pick up my phone and pretend I'm talking even though no one's calling. And I hope my phone doesn't ring and I get busted. Like we go out of such incredible ways to avoid those circumstances. But I've noticed with these kind of moments and how it's impacted my life and how I live it out is that these grudges and resentment that we hold and anger that we hold are actually more damaging to us, and they end up weighing us down, slowing us down, becoming a spiritual suffocation around us, where we start to blame, maybe correctly, but blame and be frustrated and angry, but really all we're doing is we hold on to these things. We end up holding greater weight down upon ourselves. And so the reason this verse is so important in Ecclesiastes and talking about how it's foolish for us to harbour a grudge is it's not because it's the nice Christian thing to do to forgive everybody. It's this is a path to freedom for you, not just the freedom that we know in Christ that comes through him, but also the freedom that comes from knowing who we are in him, not just being an ambassador or a representative, but knowing that the freedom that he has for us can only come if we start to live into that, which means, man, yeah, what they did hurt, but I've got to go on a healing process. It's not just an immediate, oh, you hurt me, that was really bad, that was really wrong. No, we good.
Let's be best friends again.
Yeah. Like that's unrealistic faith. But rather it's this, I've got to go through this process of learning to forgive, of letting go of this grudge and trusting God to come and fill the gap.
I really love, MJ, what you said about the fact that you can't always go back to the way it was before. And sometimes you've got to go through that process of healing. You've got to invite God into that process as well, and you've also got to set up boundaries. Practicing wisdom, it's being aware of the situation, but also having grace for that individual. There's that verse in the Bible, I think it's in the Our Father prayer, Lord, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And I think a really crucial step in forgiving others is to first understand and know and fully and deeply accept that we ourselves have been first forgiven. Like, it's really hard to forgive someone else if you're putting yourself on a pedestal. But when we bring ourselves low and we say, God, you forgave me for all the horrible things that I've done, I can extend that out to someone else.
It's that choice for us, really, isn't it? Where we move from thinking things in a hyper faith way to now this is becoming real. It's the same with if you have been in any kind of romantic relationship with someone for a period of time. The feelings of love and adoration are there, but at time they will fade. It's not to say they go away, but there has to be at times in that relationship deliberate choices along the way. I have to choose to love this person in spite of this moment. Whether in a parenting moment, you have them too. As much as they are your children, there are moments where I'm like, I've got to suck it up and I've got to love them. So too, when it comes to forgiveness, is reminding ourselves that we too have been forgiven of things that eternally only God could have forgiven. And for us to walk like him means it's our responsibility to go on that journey of learning to release that noose of resentment around us, not just for us, but for the betterment of what God is trying to do through us. And so coming to those moments, making those choices, knowing it will take time, knowing that it won't be easy, but the good news is that God has told us that He is always with us, He is always for us, and He will give us His power and strength and compassion and mercy to endure all things as we pursue Him and His way of living.
It was such a powerful visual moment for me when MJ talked about resentment like a noose around our neck. And maybe for you, that noose is feeling pretty tight. The resentment and bitterness you feel towards that person for what they did is sucking the joy and the peace and the life out of you. I'd love for you to go back and listen to episode 11 because Ash has this amazing quote that she unpacks where she talks about unforgiveness as a poison that you drink expecting the other person to die. I'd also like to take a moment to read out the Amplified Bible version of Ecclesiastes 7:9. It says, "Do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger dwells in the heart of fools." Whether it's anger that's been dwelling in your heart for a few days or whether it's been there for decades, I'd encourage you today to take a good hard look at the effect this unforgiveness is having on your life and whether or not you can go back to that moment where God first forgave you. That wraps up today's episode on the Everyday Joy podcast. We're going to be deep diving into another powerful moment from the top 50 episodes on the Everyday Joy podcast tomorrow. I look forward to catching up with you then.